Some moments do not simply arrive. They collide with a person's spirit like an unexpected storm, leaving behind a bruise that reforms the soul. Sometimes humiliation becomes the exact turning point destiny needs, cutting through fear to awaken a fire long buried beneath doubt. And in the fragile breath between a wound and a response, a life can shift so dramatically that even the one who caused the hurt cannot foresee what they've unleashed. Zuri stepped into Lagos that morning with a heart both hopeful and heavy, carrying the fragile optimism of someone who had been told no far too many times, yet still refused to surrender. The city moved with its usual restless rhythm, cars weaving through chaotic traffic, street vendors shouting prices, and the distant pulse of ambition vibrating through every sidewalk. In the midst of it all, she stood near the towering glass building where her interview would take place, clutching her resume like a lifeline. Months of unemployment had carved exhaustion into her features, yet her eyes held a quiet determination, a faint glow that refused to fade, despite the weight of rejection hanging over her like a stubborn rain cloud. She found a spot beneath an almond tree, the kind that offered just enough shade to soothe her nerves. She closed her eyes briefly, inhaling the warm air laced with the scent of roasted plantains and exhaust fumes. Under her breath, she practiced her introduction, steady, respectful, and rehearsed so many times she could recite it even in her sleep. The words trembled slightly, not with weakness, but with the undeniable fear that this opportunity might slip away, like all the others. Still, she whispered them into the morning, as though speaking them softly would persuade fate to finally listen. But fate did listen, just not in the way she hoped. A sleek black SUV rolled to a slow stop nearby, its window sliding down to reveal a young man whose presence commanded attention even before he spoke. Toby looked like someone the world had always said yes to: confident posture, immaculate clothing, and the effortless arrogance of a man raised in privilege. He watched Zuri for a moment, his gaze lingering on her resume and the nervous motion of her lips as she practiced her lines. His expression shifted into something that looked like amusement, the kind that hides cruelty beneath charm. "You're really standing here practicing how to beg?" he asked lightly, each word sharp enough to pierce. "You already look desperate. Are you sure you even belong in this building?" The words slid into the air so casually that for a moment Zuri wondered if she had imagined them. But the laughter that followed, quiet, controlled, undeniably mocking, made her stomach tighten with humiliation. A few pedestrians slowed, their eyes drifting toward her with the painful mixture of pity and curiosity she dreaded most. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing as heat rose to her cheeks. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but her voice tangled inside her chest, unable to push past the sting. Toby was not finished. Tilting his head, he added, "Some people are simply not built for success, no matter how hard they pretend. Don't embarrass yourself." His tone held the softness of someone giving friendly advice, but the cruelty beneath it was unmistakable. He offered a dismissive smile, then signaled the driver. The SUV pulled away silently, leaving behind a trail of dust and an ache she could physically feel beneath her ribs. For a long moment she stood frozen, the city noise fading into a distant hum as the weight of his words settled heavily across her shoulders. She felt exposed, small, and foolish beneath the watchful eyes of strangers. It would have been easy, so easy, to let that humiliation collapse her spirit, to walk away from the building behind her and believe the lie he had spoken. But inside her something shifted, something quiet but powerful. His insult struck not a place of weakness, but a place of deep, buried strength she had forgotten she possessed. Her hand tightened around her resume until the edges curled against her palm. She straightened her posture, inhaling slowly as the memory of his mocking smile replayed in her mind. The pain did not fade, but it changed shape, transforming into a spark that lit a fire she had never felt before. A fire that whispered she would prove herself, even if the world had never believed in her. And somewhere beneath that rising flame was a single truth she sensed but could not yet name. What if the moment meant to break her spirit becomes the very force that drives her toward a destiny even her mocker could never escape, and could never reclaim once she rises? Sometimes the world bruises a spirit until it begins to doubt its own reflection. Yet in that fragile moment, destiny sends a single pair of eyes that sees what others failed to notice. It takes only one stranger, one who looks past struggle and into quiet potential, to shift a life onto a path it never dared to imagine. And in the space between humiliation and hope, the right voice can become the lifeline a wounded heart didn't know it needed. Zuri stood motionless beneath the almond tree long after the SUV disappeared into the Lagos traffic. The city continued its relentless rhythm around her, but her world felt briefly suspended, caught between shame and the stubborn whisper urging her to keep moving. She blinked hard, forcing down the sting behind her eyes, unwilling to let tears fall in public where strangers' pity could deepen the wound. She straightened her shoulders again, steadying her breath, preparing to step forward despite the heaviness pressing on her chest. But before she could move, a soft voice broke through the surrounding noise. "My dear, are you all right?" Zuri turned, surprised to find an older woman standing a few steps away. She carried herself with an air of quiet authority, dressed in a flowing Ankara wrapper whose colors seemed to hold the warmth of sunrise. Her eyes were gentle, yet sharp with understanding, eyes that had witnessed life in all its shadows and triumphs. She watched Zuri, not with pity, but with the kind of recognition that made Zuri's heartbeat shift. "I saw what happened," the woman said thoughtfully. "Some people speak without knowing the weight their words carry. But you stood with more dignity than he could ever understand." Zuri's throat tightened again, though this time from the unexpected tenderness in the woman's tone. She opened her mouth to insist she was fine, to brush off the moment, but the truth trembled beneath her attempts at composure. The woman stepped closer, her presence steady, soothing in a way Zuri hadn't expected from a stranger on a hectic Lagos street. "My name is Madame Ireti," she continued, extending her hand. "And sometimes life brings us to the exact place we need to be, even when it feels like the world is pushing us toward the ground." Zuri hesitated before placing her hand in the woman's. Her grip was firm, yet warm, grounding her in a way she hadn't felt since leaving her last job months ago. Without fully understanding why, Zuri trusted her. There was something in Madame Ireti's voice, a balance of strength and softness, that made the humiliation she carried loosen slightly, like a knot beginning to untangle. "If you have a few minutes," Madame Ireti said gently, "come with me. I know a small place nearby. We can sit, breathe, and talk. Lagos is too harsh a place to walk through alone when your spirit has just been bruised." Zuri followed her through winding streets until they reached a modest building painted in fading earth tones. A wooden sign above the entrance read, "Ireti Women's Enterprise Center." Inside, the air carried the earthy scent of dyed fabrics and freshly brewed tea, the kind of aroma that wrapped itself around the soul like comfort. They settled into a small seating area lined with handmade cushions. As the tea warmed Zuri's palms, Madame Ireti studied her with patient curiosity. "What do you love?" she asked. Not what job she wanted, not what qualifications she had, but what she loved. The simplicity of the question struck Zuri in a place she had kept quiet for too long. She inhaled slowly. "African textiles," she whispered, a small spark flickering in her voice. "Patterns that tell stories, designs that reflect who we are. I want to create sustainable fashion, using materials that honor our culture and the environment." Madame Ireti's expression shifted, softened, brightened. Her nod was slow, purposeful. "Passion spoken with that kind of truth should never be ignored," she said. "Come, I want to show you something." She guided Zuri to a back workshop filled with sewing machines, tools, and fabric stacks in hues that seemed to hold the continent's heartbeat. Threads of every color danced across tables like captured artistry waiting to be shaped. Zuri's breath caught as a sense of belonging swept through her, unexpected, overwhelming, and almost frightening. Madame Iretti said quietly, "Start small. Start with your hands, your patience, your vision. If you're willing to learn, I am willing to guide you." Zuri looked at her, stunned. She hadn't expected kindness, opportunity, or recognition. Not today. Not after the morning's humiliation smashed her fragile confidence. Yet here she stood, invited into a workshop that felt like the echo of a dream she thought she had lost. "What do you say, my dear?" Madame Iretti asked with a knowing smile. Zuri felt that small spark inside her flare to life. Could this unexpected encounter, born from humiliation, be the doorway into a future far greater than anything Zuri ever believed she deserved? There are seasons when a person must gather the broken pieces of their spirit and shape them into something new, something stronger than what existed before. True growth does not begin the moment opportunity appears. It begins the moment courage whispers that even shattered dreams can rise again. And in the quiet struggle to rebuild oneself, destiny watches closely, waiting for the exact second a buried ember becomes a flame. Zuri arrived at the workshop before dawn most days, slipping through the creaking door with a heart still fragile, but determined. The space was cramped, cluttered with half-repaired machines, rolls of fabric, and the faint smell of old cotton mixed with green tea. Yet to her, it felt like stepping into a sanctuary. The early morning light filtered softly through the cracked windows, casting gentle shadows that danced across the tables where she would spend countless hours learning to shape her future with her own hands. She was starting from nothing, no formal training, no industry experience. But she arrived each morning with an eagerness that outshone her uncertainty. Her first lessons were humbling. Madame Iretti stood beside her, guiding her through basic stitches, machine handling, and fabric understanding. Zuri struggled often. Her fingers trembled from tension, and her stitches wavered with inconsistency. She broke needles, tangled threads, and misaligned patterns so many times that frustration clawed at her resolve. But each time she sighed, Madame Iretti offered a steady, quiet patience that made the failures feel less like proof of inadequacy and more like steps toward progress. "Precision is not born in a day," Madame Iretti would remind her. "It grows in the hands of those who refuse to give up." Zuri absorbed that truth slowly. She used it to push through the moments when she felt herself slipping back into the doubt that had haunted her for months before their meeting. Every error, every torn hem, every crooked line became part of a rhythm she was slowly learning to master. Her muscles ached from hours of practice. Her back stiffened from leaning over fabric, and her eyes stung from focusing too intensely. But beneath the exhaustion lay a steady determination that refused to die. The workshop became her second home. Some nights she stayed long after others had left, the hum of the single working sewing machine echoing through the room in a soothing, hypnotic beat. The sharp scent of dyes filled her lungs as she experimented with color blending, creating patterns that felt like extensions of her own story, vibrant, textured, layered with meaning. There were moments she accidentally spilled dye or tore delicate mesh fabrics, moments when disappointment threatened to swallow her. But just when she felt weakest, the memory of Toby's mocking voice resurfaced, not as a wound, but as a reminder of what she was fighting to rise above. Her fingers hardened over time, calloused in places where the threads burned against her skin. She pricked herself repeatedly, tiny beads of blood dotting her fingertips like the marks of someone learning to carve her path through grit rather than ease. Yet with every ache and every sting, her confidence began to strengthen, not loudly, but slowly, quietly, like a seed pushing through hardened ground. Madame Iretti introduced her to fabric quality testing, die setting, and production flow. She trained her not just to create, but to create with discipline, measuring twice, cutting once, reviewing every seam with the careful eyes of someone who respected the craft. Zuri grew more precise, more patient, more grounded. Her movements became deliberate, her touch confident. She began producing small textile pieces, scrunchies, handkerchiefs, small patterned scarves that Madame Ireti displayed at the entrance of the center. At first, only a few were sold. Then more. Then even more. The first time Zuri saw a stranger purchase an item she made, her chest tightened with an emotion she hadn't felt in months, a gentle victory blooming from the soil of perseverance. She never spoke of the tears that pricked her eyes afterward, nor of the warmth that spread through her chest as she realized she was finally creating something worth paying for. The earnings were modest, but to her they felt monumental, like confirmation that she belonged on this path. Weeks blended into months, her skills sharpened, her mind expanded, her spirit strengthened. She grew not only as a craftswoman, but as a woman reclaiming power over a life she once feared was slipping away. Yet even as her progress blossomed, a faint sense of tension lingered in the air. Something subtle, something she could not yet name. There were whispers in the market, shifts in the city's business circles, murmurs of disruptions in places she didn't yet understand. Zuri, however, was too immersed in her growth to notice what was moving beyond her horizon. As her talent blooms quietly beneath Lagos's bustling sky, what hidden forces are already shifting in the shadows, slowly weaving themselves into the destiny she is unknowingly stepping toward. Some victories begin as whispers, soft, uncertain, almost too fragile to claim, until suddenly the world turns its gaze and realizes something extraordinary has been quietly forming. Success often rises from the edges of obscurity, building itself stitch by stitch, until even those who once overlooked a dream can no longer deny the brilliance taking shape before them. The workshop buzzed with a steady hum that mirrored Zuri's growing confidence. The once cluttered tables now held fabrics arranged in thoughtful order, their colors reflecting not just creativity, but intention. Her movements had become fluid, each gesture carrying the assurance of someone who no longer doubted her place in the craft she was shaping with both mind and spirit. She often worked deep into the night, the soft rhythm of her sewing machine blending with the distant sounds of Lagos settling into its evening breath. It was in these quiet hours that she found her truest flow, when the world felt still enough for her imagination to stretch without boundaries. It was during one of these evenings that a traveler from Ghana wandered into the center, drawn by the vivid displays of textiles hanging near the entrance. The man introduced himself as Kweku, a boutique owner from Accra, known for sourcing authentic African designs. His eyes swept over the various pieces on display, thoughtful and discerning. Nothing held him for more than a moment, until he reached the corner where Zuri's newest patterned scarves were arranged with understated elegance. He paused, his hand lightly grazing one of the fabrics as though feeling a story woven into its surface. The design carried elements Zuri had studied for weeks, patterns inspired by Adinkra symbolism blended with modern geometric lines. It held cultural depth and contemporary boldness, a delicate balance that was far more intentional than she let herself admit. "Who made these?" Kweku asked, his voice filled with curiosity rather than politeness. Madame Ireti called Zuri from the back room, her knowing smile widening as she watched the boutique owner's interest sharpen. Zuri stepped forward cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Kweku studied her for a moment, then returned his attention to her work, lifting each piece with a reverence that made Zuri's chest warm with disbelief. "These designs," he murmured, "are unlike anything I have come across recently. The colors speak, the patterns breathe. You have captured tradition without trapping it in the past." Zuri blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. She opened her mouth to respond, but he was already pulling out his phone, photographing the pieces one by one with the practiced care of someone who knew their value. "I want to place an order," he said finally. "A large one. Large enough to fill a section of my boutique. Can you produce 50 pieces like these within 6 weeks?" The room seemed to tilt slightly. 50 pieces. 6 weeks. It was the biggest opportunity she had ever received, one that eclipsed every small sale she had made up to that point. She felt her pulse hammering against her ribs, a mixture of excitement and fear swirling through her. She looked at Madame Iretti, whose nod came with a confidence Zuri wasn't sure she deserved, but deeply needed. "Yes," Zuri said quietly, then stronger. "Yes, I can." The order became the turning point she had never anticipated. Suddenly, the workshop needed more hands. She interviewed young apprentices from the neighborhood, 2 bright girls named Amaka and Bisi, who arrived with eagerness and trembling hands that reminded Zuri of her own beginnings. Training them brought out a level of leadership she didn't know she possessed, teaching them not just the craft, but the patience, precision, and reverence Madame Iretti had once taught her. As the days passed, photos of Zuri's work began circulating online. Kweku posted about her on his boutique's page. Customers who visited the workshop shared images to their social media feeds. Influencers across West Africa reposted her designs, impressed by the patterns that carried both culture and innovation. Within weeks, her name spread far beyond Lagos, across Nigeria, then Ghana, then even into online African fashion groups in the UK and US. The workshop could barely keep up. Demand grew faster than her small space could allow. Orders piled in. Messages flooded her inbox. And each morning, as she unlocked the workshop door, the air felt different, charged with a momentum she had once thought impossible. Yet while her world expanded, destiny was moving quietly elsewhere too. Far from her workshop, someone who once dismissed her now stood unknowingly at the edge of her rising path, pushed closer by the same winds lifting her name across the region. As Zuri's star climbs higher, whose shadow from her past is drifting closer, drawn not by kindness, but by the force of her undeniable ascent. Expansion tests the heart more fiercely than failure ever could. For while failure wounds in silence, success demands strength, clarity, and sacrifices that most never see. And sometimes, the very dreams you prayed for arrive carrying weights heavy enough to break the unprepared, unless your scars have already taught you how to rise. The name Zuri Threads Laothard appeared on the registration documents with a quiet authority that made Zuri's breath catch. The moment felt unreal. Her business no longer a small workshop tucked behind an old building, no longer a quiet hobby birthed from struggle, but an official entity stepping into the world with her name etched boldly across its foundation. She stared at the stamped papers, tracing her fingers over the raised seal, feeling the shift deep inside her chest. What she had built from desperation and determination was no longer merely surviving. It was expanding. With official status came visibility. Investors, some local and others from neighboring countries, began sending messages filled with polite enthusiasm and strategic interest. They spoke in smooth tones about potential collaborations, growth strategies, and market forecasts. Many proposals were tempting, glittering with numbers that promised rapid expansion. Yet beneath the shine, Zuri sensed threads of control, the kind that could pull her dream away from the authenticity that birthed it. She read every proposal carefully, leaning often on Madame Iretti's quiet wisdom, learning how to decode the polite deceptions wrapped inside professional language. It was her first taste of the corporate world, a world that demanded sharp intuition, resilience, and clarity. Despite the noise of rising expectations, Zuri focused on building from within. She secured a larger workspace, an open-floor studio with sunlight filtering softly across wide tables, shelves filled with rolls of Ankara fabrics, and a ceiling high enough to let the room breathe with possibility. She spent nights restructuring production systems, streamlining workflow, organizing inventory, documenting processes, and creating a schedule that allowed her small team to grow in skill and confidence. Each task demanded patience, foresight, and a discipline she had once doubted she possessed. In the new studio, her apprentices moved with renewed purpose. Amaka learned pattern cutting with surprising precision, while Bisi discovered a natural talent for color pairing. Together, they formed a team bonded not by convenience, but by shared belief in the craft they were shaping. Zuri's leadership matured quietly through each decision she made: when to encourage, when to challenge, and when to step back and let others rise on their own. Her brand's identity sharpened as well. Customers praised Zuri Threads for its authenticity, designs rooted in cultural pride, yet refined through modern creativity. Her pieces carried stories of heritage, of resilience, of hands that knew what it meant to work through pain and still produce beauty. West African fashion magazines began featuring her creations. Influencers spoke about her craftsmanship with admiration. Boutiques from Senegal and Kenya sent inquiries about stocking her collections. Each new milestone filled her with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, reminding her how far she had come from the day a stranger mocked her for unemployment. But with growth came pressure. Deadlines tightened. Client expectations intensified. Machines broke under the strain of increased production. Some nights Zuri felt her chest tighten with the weight of responsibility. Employees depending on her, customers counting on her, investors watching quietly from the distance. She worked until her fingers throbbed again, the familiar ache reminding her of where she began. But this time, the pain did not signal fear. It signaled expansion. It signaled a life, stretching beyond the borders she once believed were permanent. Through each challenge, she found herself sharpening, not hardening, but clarifying. Her decisions became quicker, her instincts stronger. She learned to negotiate contracts without shrinking. She learned to send back defective materials without apologizing. She learned that leadership required both firmness and compassion. And slowly, she became the kind of woman she once admired from afar, the kind who could hold both vision and burden in the same weary hands. Yet unseen to her, whispers were beginning to circulate in another corner of Lagos. Whispers about a once powerful corporate heir whose empire had begun to fracture under the pressure of poor decisions, market shifts, and internal scandal. Whispers about a man who had spent years dismissing others, unaware that a storm was inching toward him, a storm shaped not by vengeance, but by destiny. And in those whispers, her name had begun to appear. As Zuri Threads rises with unstoppable momentum, whose failing empire is now turning its desperate gaze toward her, unaware that the woman he once mocked may soon be the one he must answer to. Empires rarely crumble with noise. They decay in silence first, long before the world hears the crash. And sometimes, the loudest fall begins with cracks so small that only truth can see them, while arrogance walks blindly past, believing nothing can touch what privilege has built. Toby Aduale's office towered above Lagos Island like a monument to inherited power. Glass walls, polished marble floors, and a view that once made him feel untouchable. From the outside, Aduale Textiles Group still looked like the empire his father built over decades, respected, wealthy, and deeply rooted in West African trade. But inside, beneath the glossy floors and echoing hallways, the structure had begun to rot in ways only the employees could feel. Behind Toby's broad mahogany desk lay stacks of ignored financial reports, each one carrying warnings written in increasingly urgent tones. Declining profits, rising operational costs, market shifts, unpaid supplier invoices. But Toby flipped through them with careless fingertips, stopping only long enough to push the files aside so he could create space for a new imported gadget, a lunch delivery, or another impulsive purchase meant to distract him from responsibility. The empire he inherited demanded discipline, foresight, and humility. He offered none. Where his father had run the company with precision and respect, knowing every supplier by name and walking the production floors daily, Toby preferred the comfort of luxury lounges, weekend yacht parties, and business meetings that were more social gathering than strategy. His decisions were driven by ego rather than insight, often made in haste and corrected too late. He invested company funds into risky ventures without research, hired friends based on loyalty rather than competence, and ignored the tightening tension among his management team. Inside the factory, workers whispered in anxious tones. Looms that once ran like clockwork now rattled with neglect. Raw material deliveries arrived late, sometimes not at all, leaving production lines disrupted for hours. Morale dipped as salaries were delayed, benefits reduced, and supervisors barked instructions fueled by their own growing fear. The soft rhythm that once defined the factory had shifted into something jagged, an unpredictable dance of chaos and exhaustion. Middle managers held closed-door meetings, some pushing for urgent restructuring, others trying to patch problems with temporary fixes. But their concerns never moved beyond the corridor outside Toby's office. He brushed off every warning with an easy shrug, dismissing them as exaggerations from employees unwilling to adapt. To him, the Adawail Empire was unshakable. After all, hadn't it been built on decades of dominance? Hadn't it survived storms greater than these? The belief settled over him like a shield, blinding him to the truth unraveling beneath his feet. Suppliers were the first to lose patience. Their calls, once filled with warmth and mutual respect, now carried a thin edge of irritation. Some stopped extending credit. Others raised prices to compensate for delayed payments. A few quietly shifted their loyalty to smaller, rising brands whose founders treated them with dignity and kept their word. Toby's arrogance blinded him to this shift. He believed suppliers would always prioritize his empire because of its legacy. He never considered that legacy meant nothing if current leadership did not honor it. As debts mounted, rumors began to spread, softly at first, then with increasing clarity. Lagos business circles whispered about mismanagement, inflated spending, failing leadership, and a company whose stability had begun to tilt dangerously. Investors who once fought for a seat at Toby's table now watched from a distance, cautious, waiting, calculating. Some predicted collapse, others predicted takeover. Everyone agreed on one thing: the empire was in trouble. But Toby refused to see it. He walked through the office with the same confident stride, offering empty reassurances about upcoming expansions and grand partnerships he never actually pursued. Employees glanced at him with a mixture of fear and disbelief. He still believed the company's problems would fix themselves, that market cycles would shift magically in his favor, that fortune would return simply because he expected it. Yet beneath his denial, something deeper stirred, a fear he refused to name. It slipped through the cracks of his confidence at night when he stared at his ceiling, unable to sleep. It tightened his chest during meetings he pretended to control. It whispered that privilege could not shield him forever. And while he clung desperately to the illusion of power, another name began rising quietly, spoken in design studios, online marketplaces, fashion events, and entrepreneurial circles. A name repeated, not with worry, but with admiration: Zuri. Her success moved like a tide, subtle at first, then undeniable. Her brand gained traction across West Africa. Her voice grew louder in conversations about sustainable fashion, and her leadership began drawing attention from those tired of Toby's carelessness. She was everything he refused to be: disciplined, visionary, grounded, and rising with a momentum shaped by grit rather than inheritance. The empire cracking beneath him had not yet collapsed, but the ground beneath it had begun shifting toward someone who understood value far beyond the wealth he took for granted. And while Toby clings to the fading illusion of power, Who is the rising force quietly reshaping the future? A force he once mocked without knowing she would one day decide the fate of his crumbling empire. Fate rarely announces itself. It arrives in moments so ordinary they almost slip by unnoticed until two paths collide again, with the weight of everything left unsaid. And sometimes, the person you once dismissed becomes the very face of a future you can no longer outrun. The Lagos International Business Expo stretched across the convention center in a brilliant mosaic of color, culture, and innovation. Rows of booths displayed handcrafted textiles, agrotech prototypes, digital startups, sustainable fashion pieces, and ideas that pulsed with the future of Africa's economic rise. The air buzzed with conversation, entrepreneurs pitching passionately, investors scanning for potential, journalists capturing the energy of transformation. At the heart of the fashion and textile section stood a booth that radiated a quiet magnetism, Zuri threads lelite, designed with clean lines, warm earthy tones, and fabrics that glowed with artistry rooted in tradition, yet sharpened by modern vision. Visitors paused not just because it was beautiful, but because it felt alive, full of purpose, intention, and the kind of innovation that didn't shout, but commanded attention through authenticity. Zuri stood at the center of it all, with the calm confidence of someone who had earned her place, stitch by stitch. She wore a structured jacket made from her signature fabric, deep navy adorned with gold-threaded geometric motifs inspired by ancient West African symbols. It was bold, yet elegant, mirroring the journey that had shaped her. Investors approached her with eager smiles, journalists requested interviews, and young designers watched her with admiration, as though witnessing a dream walking in human form. Her apprentices, now trained designers in their own right, presented samples to visitors, demonstrating the weaving techniques she and Madame Ireti had perfected. Videos played on a screen behind them, showcasing her sustainable process, natural dyes from local plants, hand-woven fibers from small community farms, and designs meant to honor cultural heritage, while pushing global fashion forward. Her booth didn't just display products, it told a story. And then, across the bustling aisle, another presence entered the hall. Toby Adewale. He walked in with shoulders held high, trying to maintain the image he'd crafted his entire life. Polished, self-assured, untouchable. But beneath the facade, exhaustion darkened his eyes and tension stiffened his movements. His company's decline had begun to show silently in every gesture. He had come to the expo hoping to find potential investors or suppliers willing to extend grace to a sinking empire. Instead, he walked into a moment he never expected. He saw her before he registered her name. Zuri, her posture, the crowd around her, the elegance of her booth, the attention she commanded without raising her voice. For a moment, his steps faltered. The memory struck him sharply, the day he mocked her on the sidewalk, laughing at her for being jobless, dismissing her potential as though it meant nothing. Back then, she had stood alone in faded clothes, clutching a folder of rejected applications, her future dimmed by the weight of repeated failures. Now she stood wrapped in success that radiated from her with quiet brilliance. He froze at the edge of the aisle, disbelief carved into his expression. The logo behind her, Zuri threads lelite, felt like a blow. He blinked, as if trying to force his mind to accept that the woman he once insulted had built something so large the entire expo seemed anchored around her presence. He stepped closer without meaning to, drawn by a mix of curiosity, guilt, and something more unsettling, recognition that the world had shifted in ways he had never anticipated. Investors he had once expected to approach him now clustered around her, listening with genuine engagement as she spoke about ethical production, cultural preservation, and expanding into global markets. Her voice flowed with clarity and conviction, each word carrying authority he had never granted her in his mind. His chest tightened. She wasn't just successful, she was respected. He watched as a Ghanaian boutique owner shook her hand with excitement, confirming a partnership that would expand her brand further across West Africa. Photographers captured images of her products, bloggers recorded short clips of her speaking, and even established CEOs paused to study her designs. Zuri moved through it all with calm assurance, thanking each visitor with humility that made her rise feel even more profound. Her confidence wasn't loud. It was earned, rooted in nights she worked through exhaustion, in failures she turned into fuel, in dreams she rebuilt with calloused hands and unwavering focus. Toby felt his own pulse amplify, hands growing slightly damp despite the coolness of the air-conditioned hall. For the first time in years, he felt small, not because she intended it, but because truth had finally caught up to him. He realized that the mockery he once treated as entertainment had been a turning point for someone else, a spark that ignited a journey he now watched unfold before him. He lingered in the crowd, trying to blend in, hoping she wouldn't see him. Pride tugged sharply at him, urging him to walk away, to preserve the fragile illusion that nothing had changed. But another force, quieter yet heavier, held him still. Regret. His gaze remained locked on her, on the success he had never imagined she would achieve, on the strength that forced him to confront the cracks forming in his own empire. She had risen through determination. He had drifted through privilege, and now fate had woven their paths together again, demanding acknowledgement. Zuri turned slightly, her eyes scanning the busy hall. Toby's breath caught as she glanced in his direction, her gaze stopping just a few feet from where he stood. Will Toby swallow his pride and step forward into the moment fate has placed before him, or slip back into the crowd before she notices the fractures spreading through the empire he once believed invincible? Power does not thunder into the room. It slips in quietly, reshaping the air with a force felt only by the one losing it. And in the trembling breath of someone who once believed they ruled the moment, you can hear the exact second destiny rearranges the balance between two lives. The noise of the expo swelled around Zuri's booth like distant waves, steady, rhythmic, unbothered by the silent storm unfolding just steps away. Investors moved in and out with effortless excitement, each conversation deepening Zuri's growing influence. Meanwhile, Toby stood frozen at the edge of her display, struggling to steady his breath beneath the weight of a truth he could no longer outrun. For years he had walked through Lagos, believing the world bent toward him by default. But now, standing before the woman he had once humiliated, he felt the ground shift beneath his certainty. He inhaled sharply, forcing his shoulders back, smoothing his expression into one of casual confidence. It was an old mask, one he had worn since adolescence, and for a moment it slid into place with practiced ease. Toby stepped forward, weaving through the crowd with the grace of someone pretending to be unaffected. But the closer he came to Zuri, the more that mask trembled. He could feel the eyes of passing visitors on her designs, could hear compliments directed at her work, could sense the admiration shaping the energy around her. Each detail chipped at the pride he tried to hold upright. Zuri glanced up as he approached, her expression composed and unreadable. Not cold, not warm, simply professional, like a CEO assessing a stranger with no emotional history. The calmness in her eyes unsettled him more than any anger could have. She greeted a pair of investors with a respectful nod, answering their questions with confidence, never once acknowledging Toby's presence until the conversation concluded. Her poise made him feel like a boy standing before a woman who had outgrown every version of him the world once praised. When she finally turned toward him, her voice carried the cool clarity of someone who had built herself from quiet suffering into unshakable purpose. "Toby Adwale," she said. "It has been a long time." He swallowed hard, his throat tightening around words he wasn't sure he could trust himself to speak. "Zuri, your work is impressive. The growth, everything, it's remarkable." She offered a polite smile, but nothing in her posture shifted. No leaning in, no softening, no hint of the pain he once caused her. Her neutrality unsettled him more than hostility would have. He had prepared himself for resentment. He had not prepared himself to be irrelevant. The moment worsened as two investors stepped forward, recognizing Zuri from a recent feature in an African business magazine. They praised her innovations, her global potential, her leadership. One even mentioned plans to collaborate with her brand for a continental fashion initiative. Through it all, Zuri responded with humble confidence, never arrogant, never boastful, yet undeniably powerful. Toby stood there, forced to listen, forced to witness success he had once implied she would never taste. Every compliment directed at her felt like a quiet reminder of the arrogance he'd wielded so casually years earlier. He tried to hide the discomfort spreading across his features, but Zuri read it easily, her perception sharpened by years of learning how to interpret people without trusting their words. When the investors finally moved on, Toby attempted to reclaim control of the moment. He cleared his throat, straightening the collar of his suit. "Your company, it's doing well. I can see that. And I think, perhaps, we might be able to create something together." Zuri tilted her head slightly, studying him with the calm, calculating gaze of a leader evaluating risk. Her silence pressed against him, making his next words spill out faster, more unraveled than he intended. "My company is going through some restructuring, market shifts, you know how it is. But with your growth and my experience, I believe a partnership could benefit us both." He delivered the last line with a confidence he no longer felt. Beneath it, desperation flickered, subtle but unmistakable. He needed her more than he dared admit. Zuri noticed everything: the tension in his jaw, the quiver in his breath, the faint anxiety behind the forced charm. She knew when someone approached her from genuine admiration, and she knew when someone approached her to save themselves from drowning. She clasped her hands lightly, her nails tapping against the table in a rhythm that matched her thoughts. "A partnership," she echoed slowly, as though tasting the word before deciding whether it belonged in her story at all. Toby mistook her measured tone for consideration, but she saw the truth beneath his proposal. He wasn't offering an opportunity. He was grasping for survival, and for the first time, he understood what it felt like to stand before someone holding power he could not influence. As Toby waits for her answer, unable to read the quiet storm behind her steady gaze, is he reaching for an alliance that could save him, or inviting the beginning of a downfall he can no longer prevent? When lies collide with truth, only one survives the weight of revelation. And when the facade finally fractures, the world watches, quietly, curiously, as the powerful scramble to hold together an empire already dissolving beneath their feet. The first tremor came quietly, a leaked report on a mid-level finance blog mentioning irregularities in Adawale Textiles' quarterly filings. At first, Toby dismissed it with the same arrogance he used to brush aside warnings from his advisors. He believed reputation alone could silence noise. But scandals, once they find oxygen, grow with frightening speed. Within 24 hours, 2 national newspapers published investigative articles exposing deeper inconsistencies: inflated numbers, delayed audits, supplier complaints, and a suspicious pattern in how the company managed export funds. Suddenly, the boardroom, once a place where Toby strutted with unchallenged confidence, felt tense and suffocating. His managers avoided eye contact. Shareholders filled the room with clipped voices and tightened expressions. Financial analysts demanded answers he had no capacity or willingness to provide. He blamed external factors, global market shifts, competitors, even the media's so-called agenda. But the truth had slipped free, and every attempt to bury it only made the cracks spread faster. By the end of the week, the situation unraveled completely. A law firm representing multiple suppliers filed a lawsuit accusing Attawale Textiles of unpaid debts stretching back nearly a year. Another creditor threatened asset seizure. Banks froze certain accounts pending investigation. And with every headline, the company's stock value dropped like a stone hurled into dark water. Inside the corridors of the corporation, chaos replaced pride. Employees whispered in hallways, worried about salaries and job security. Some secretly updated their resumes. Others scanned news articles during lunch breaks, hoping the rumors were exaggerated, only to discover they were understated. The brand that once commanded respect now carried the pungent scent of scandal. Toby stormed through meetings with forced bravado, shouting instructions, firing department heads, demanding loyalty he no longer had any right to expect. But behind the outbursts lay something far more dangerous than anger. Fear. Not fear of public humiliation, though that gnawed at him endlessly, but fear of confronting the truth he had ignored for too long. His empire was falling because of him. His reckless spending, his refusal to adapt to market trends, his arrogance in dismissing ethical fashion movements, his habit of silencing warnings instead of addressing them. Each decision had woven another thread into the noose, tightening around Attawale Textiles. The empire he inherited now sagged beneath his mismanagement, and there was no one left to blame. Shareholders who once flattered him began exiting quietly, selling their stakes before they lost everything. Some sent polite messages expressing regret. Others sent none at all. Advisors, once eager to stay aligned with power, now urged him, boldly, urgently, to sell while the company still had fragments of value left. Their words landed like blows, each one pressing the reality deeper. He was cornered, and time had run out. As days passed, the numbers worsened. Lawsuits multiplied. Media coverage intensified. A senior supplier from Ghana withdrew completely, stating the company had become too unstable to trust. Employees protested overdue salaries. And for the first time, Toby saw cameras waiting outside his headquarters, not to celebrate success, but to capture decline. Late one evening, he sat alone in his office. Lights dim, blinds half closed, the city outside flickering like a world he no longer belonged to. He stared at the financial projections on his screen, each red arrow pointing downward, like a verdict. His phone buzzed with messages he had no strength left to answer. He leaned back, feeling the weight of everything he had failed to protect pressing against his chest. His father's portrait hung on the wall behind him, a reminder of the legacy he had inherited with pride and squandered with negligence. Toby couldn't bring himself to look at it. He lowered his head into his hands, fingers digging into his hair as silence filled the office with a suffocating intensity. For the first time, he allowed himself to whisper the truth he had refused to acknowledge aloud. The empire is collapsing, and there's nothing left to stop it. The next morning, he met with his board. Their expressions were grim, practical, stripped of loyalty. They presented numbers he already knew. They offered advice he already dreaded. Sell, they repeated. Sell, before there is nothing left to sell. Toby nodded slowly, his resistance broken. There was no choice. The only question that remained was whether anyone would want what had become a sinking ship. He signed the authorization for brokers to seek buyers, expecting a list of interested corporations or foreign investors eager to acquire a once powerful brand. But when the list arrived, it was shockingly short. Just one buyer. Only one. And as Toby read the name, his breath stilled, his heartbeat stumbling into uneasy silence. At his darkest hour, why does only one buyer step forward? And what destiny awaits him when he realizes exactly who is ready to claim the empire slipping from his hands? The sweetest victories are rarely loud. They rise from quiet wounds, from swallowed humiliation, from nights spent rebuilding a shattered sense of self. And when they finally stand tall enough to reshape destiny, the world cannot help but pause and witness the power born from pain, transformed into purpose. News of Adawal. Textiles collapse reached Zuri not through gossip, but through a formal email from her investment advisory team. She was reviewing fabric samples when her phone vibrated gently on the table, displaying a subject line that carried the weight of shifting fortunes. Potential acquisition opportunity, Adawal Textiles. She clicked it calmly, her expression composed, her heartbeat steady, not from lack of emotion, but from the quiet discipline she had learned over years of rebuilding herself. The document unfolded across her tablet screen, a detailed breakdown of the company's financial crisis, the lawsuits, the unpaid debts, the shareholder exodus, the instability in management, and the urgent recommendation that a buyer be found before the corporation officially collapsed. At the bottom, highlighted in bold, was a single line that made Zuri inhale deeply. Current market value significantly undervalued due to mismanagement. She sat back, allowing the reality to settle. The empire that once stood as a symbol of wealth, privilege, and arrogance, the same empire whose heir had mocked her worth, was now trembling at the edge of ruin. But she did not feel triumph. Not yet. What she felt instead was a strange, layered calm, a clarity shaped not by revenge, but by experience. She forwarded the proposal to Madame Iretti and invited her to the studio office. The older woman arrived within an hour, walking with her usual composed dignity. She studied Zuri's expression before studying the documents. Her brow lifted slightly, her silence thoughtful rather than surprised. "So," Madame Iretti murmured, settling into her seat. "The tree that once shaded him has finally cracked." Zuri nodded, choosing her words with care. "They're desperate for a buyer, and the price is far lower than its true infrastructural worth." Madame Iretti tilted her head, observing Zuri closely. "And what do you see when you look at this? Opportunity? Closure? Something else?" Zuri exhaled slowly. "I see a company with cultural branches that once held potential. I see assets that could strengthen sustainable fashion across West Africa. I see factories that, under ethical leadership, could provide fair employment. I see a legacy ruined by arrogance, but not beyond redemption." Madame Iretti listened, her expression unreadable. Then she leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "My child, never let revenge pretend to be purpose. If you are considering this acquisition, ask yourself one question. Is this for your mission or your pride?" Zuri held her gaze without wavering. "It is for the mission, and for the future I am building, not the past I survived." A long silence followed. Then Madame Iretti smiled, a small proud smile that carried the weight of mentorship fulfilled. "Then build your offer, but build it with precision, not emotion." With renewed clarity, Zuri called a meeting with her advisory team. They analyzed every corner of Adawal Textiles, infrastructure, debts, production gaps, labor issues, export potential, environmental impact, and brand salvageability. Zuri asked targeted questions, challenging assumptions, seeking a proposal that reflected not only business intelligence, but cultural responsibility. She drafted her acquisition bid with meticulous care. It was elegant, it was firm, it was visionary. Her offer did not seek to revive Adawal Textiles in its old image. It aimed to absorb it fully, transforming its factories into sustainable textile hubs, repurposing its brand into ethical production networks, and rebuilding its identity through craftsmanship rooted in African heritage and community empowerment. She offered fair severance terms for workers, restructuring plans for factories, and long-term commitments to local sourcing. Her investors, already captivated by her strategic clarity, supported her wholeheartedly. Some admired the courage of her move, others saw the deep financial potential, but all recognized one truth: Zuri was no longer rising. She had risen. As she reviewed the final version of her proposal, she felt no tremor of fear, no shadow of doubt. Instead, she felt a quiet readiness, the kind that forms after years of shaping oneself, the kind that whispers, "This moment belongs to you," because you built the strength to carry it. Her legal team submitted the acquisition bid to the seller's representatives. Emails were sent. Documents were sealed. The process moved faster than expected, because there were no competing offers. The board of Attawale Textiles, desperate and cornered, responded with immediate interest. But there was one final step. Toby Attawale had to be informed of the identity of the sole buyer. As she prepared for the inevitable call, the memory of his laughter, the careless cruelty of that morning years ago, drifted through her mind. But it no longer hurt. It no longer burned. It no longer held any power. She had outgrown it. When the news reaches Toby, when he finally discovers that the only pen capable of rewriting his future rests in Zuri's steady hands, what storms of regret and revelation will rise within him as destiny closes its circle. Destiny always returns to the exact place where arrogance once stood laughing, forcing the heart that once felt untouchable to taste its own fragility. And in that moment, when pride bows its head, the world quietly records the shift of power that was years in the making. The boardroom on the 21st floor of Attawale Towers had once been Toby's throne. Every polished surface, every glass panel, every leather chair had reflected his confidence back at him. He entered the room that morning with the same stride he had used for years, chin high, shoulders back, trying to hide the exhaustion buried in the shadows beneath his eyes. His board had informed him that the buyer had arrived early. A high-level corporate delegation, they said. A strategic investor. A group with significant global influence. He imagined foreign executives, perhaps a European textile group or an Asian manufacturing conglomerate. He rehearsed lines in his mind for potential negotiation, attempting to stitch together whatever dignity he had left. But beneath the surface, anxiety tightened his chest. He knew this meeting was the final chapter, the place where legacy was signed away. He pushed open the boardroom door and froze. Sitting at the head of the table, in the seat he had claimed all his life, was Zuri. Not the Zuri he once mocked outside an office building, not the young woman carrying rejected resumes in a worn folder. This was a woman transformed, poised, unshaken, wrapped in authority so quiet and refined that it stole the breath from the room. Her Ankara jacket, deep emerald with sophisticated woven patterns, contrasted against the sterile corporate backdrop, making her presence impossible to look away from. Her posture was dignified, her hands folded calmly on the table, her eyes steady with a depth of leadership that made the room feel different than it ever had under him. The board members stood as she acknowledged them with a slight nod. Toby stood in the doorway, unable to move, unable to breathe for a moment. His world narrowed to a single, undeniable truth. She was the buyer. She was the one holding the fate of his collapsing empire. She was the woman he once dismissed, and destiny had brought him here to witness it. A subtle shock rippled through him, visible only in the tightening of his jaw and the stiffness of his fingers. His pride scrambled to find footing, but the old arrogance no longer fit him. Not here. Not today. "Welcome, Mr. Attawale," Zuri said with calm professionalism. Her voice carried neither softness nor spite, only composure, only clarity. "Please have a seat. We're ready to begin." He walked to his chair slowly, each step heavier than the last. Across the table he saw the acquisition documents neatly arranged. Each page bore her company's name in crisp print. Zuri Threads Limited. The name that had once been invisible to him now hovered above his own legacy like a verdict. As the lawyers and board members reviewed the terms aloud, Toby barely heard them. His gaze drifted repeatedly toward Zuri. She didn't avoid his eyes, nor did she seek them. She simply existed with a grace that made confrontation unnecessary. She was not here to settle scores. She was here to lead. The contract slid toward her for final signature. The room fell silent. She picked up the pen, turning it lightly between her fingers. A gesture not of hesitation, but of understanding the weight of the moment. Then, with one fluid stroke, she signed. Her name, firm, steady, complete. It was done. Adwale Textiles, once the inheritance he believed would secure his place in the world, now belonged fully, legally, and irreversibly to the woman he once belittled. The shift of power was not loud, not dramatic, not humiliating. It was elegant, quiet, undeniable. Zuri closed the folder, offering a respectful nod to the board. She thanked them for their cooperation with the same professionalism she showed in every business interaction. But beneath the calm, her presence carried a message the room absorbed instinctively. Power moves differently when built from resilience. Toby felt heat rise beneath his collar. Not from anger. Anger would have required a sense of entitlement he no longer possessed, but from the raw, humbling realization that he was witnessing his past self from the outside. His careless mockery, his blind privilege, his arrogance, and her transformation into everything he had once failed to see. She stood to shake hands with each board member. When she finally turned toward him, he rose to meet her, though his legs felt unsteady. Their hands met. Her grip was firm. He was trembling. "Congratulations," he managed, his voice thin in the quiet room. "Thank you," she replied simply. There was no revenge in her tone, no triumph dripping from her words, just maturity earned through years of labor he never thought she was capable of, and that was what humbled him most. Now that Zuri holds full ownership of the empire he once mocked her over, what choice will she make? Extend grace, demand accountability, or reshape his future in a way he never saw coming? Some triumphs roar, others whisper. But the rarest victories are the ones shaped not by vengeance, not by ego, but by the quiet strength of a heart that refuses to become what once wounded it. For true power is measured not in what you take, but in who you choose to be once destiny finally bows in your direction. The first morning after the acquisition settled, Zuri stood alone in the executive suite, the same office that had once belonged to Toby's late father, the man who built the empire before arrogance cracked its foundation. The room felt different now, not heavier, not foreign, simply ready. Ready for a new chapter, a new purpose, a new breath of life after years of stagnation. Light filtered through the windows with natural clarity, illuminating long tables, dusty files, and abandoned blueprints. Nothing in the space intimidated her. She walked slowly through the room, her fingertips brushing the edges of old furniture, absorbing the history without allowing it to define her. She did not buy the company to destroy Toby, or to parade her triumph across Lagos. She bought it because she saw what it could be, because in her heart, she knew that the empire had the bones of something meaningful: craft, tradition, creativity, values his father had once built it upon, before corruption overshadowed everything. Standing in the silence of that office, she felt not victory, but responsibility. A quiet calling to turn this place into something worthy of the people it served. Within weeks, changes began. Swift, intentional, deeply rooted in integrity. Departments were restructured, not to punish, but to restore order where chaos had reigned. Financial transparency was enforced. Wasteful spending was cut. Old neglected textile lines were revived with modern sustainable methods. Zuri invited innovators, young African designers, artisans, and entrepreneurs to collaborate on new projects. She created an internal program for training unemployed youth, equipping them with skills in textile design, branding, and craftsmanship. What once was a crumbling empire now pulsed with possibilities. Employees who had lived under fear and instability felt relief blossom across their days. Meetings were no longer dominated by explosive egos, but by thoughtful planning and open dialogue. In the cafeteria, whispers of uncertainty were replaced with cautious optimism. Even longtime workers who had grown cynical found themselves watching Zuri with admiration. She was firm but fair, visionary yet grounded, driven but compassionate. She didn't rule the corporation. She nurtured it. Meanwhile, Toby lingered in the shadows of hallways he used to walk with swagger. He avoided the top floors, moving instead between small offices where old staff barely noticed him. Gone was the arrogance that once defined him. In its place was a quiet, unsettling humility. The weight of everything he had lost pressed into his posture, slowed his steps, softened his voice. For days he debated whether to approach Zuri. Pride warred with desperation. Shame battled the faint hope of redemption. Finally, one morning, he appeared outside her office. No entourage, no expensive suit, no polished facade. Just a man stripped bare of all illusions. When she invited him in, he sat carefully, as though afraid to disturb the air between them. "Zuri," he began, his voice low, steady but fragile. "I know I have no right to ask for anything. Not after how I treated you. Not after how I failed my own company. But if there is any role at all, any place I can start over." He paused, exhaling sharply, the weight of humility settling visibly across his shoulders. "I want to learn. I need to learn." She watched him with a calm that carried neither bitterness nor gloating. She saw not the man who once mocked her, but the man stripped of privilege, standing at the door of reality for the first time. And she did not speak immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the magnitude of the moment. When she finally replied, her tone was measured, grounded, almost gentle. "If you truly want to learn," she said, "then you must begin where learning actually happens, not at the top, not in an office." She slid a small badge across the table, simple, unadorned. "Junior trainee, production floor, reporting to the head of textile operations." He stared at it, stunned. It was a position far beneath anything he had ever imagined for himself. Yet strangely, he did not feel insulted. He felt relieved, seen, given a path back to his own humanity. He whispered, "Thank you," not as a formality, but as the first honest words he had spoken in years. Over the months that followed, the corporation blossomed under Zuri's leadership. Innovation surged, partnerships flourished. Young creatives found a home where their visions were celebrated. The company became a hub for purpose-driven work, a beacon across Africa for ethical fashion and sustainable manufacturing. And quietly, on the production floor, Toby learned humility, handling fabrics, studying designs, understanding the labor that had always supported his previous life. He grew quieter, wiser, more reflective. Not because Zuri punished him, because grace rebuilt him, and so begins the chapter. Destiny had waited years to reveal. Born from mockery, rebuilt by grace, and guided by a woman who chose purpose over revenge, setting into motion a future neither of them could yet imagine. If this story stirred something deep inside you, don't leave silently. Subscribe now so you never miss the next destiny-changing African tale. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that grace rewrites futures, and tell me in the comments, what moment hit your heart the hardest? Your voice keeps this journey alive. Let's rise together.